NATO admits another of its bombs goes astray. This time, a Belgrade hospital pays the price. 3 patients are killed. Through the eyes of the innocent, a child's view of the conflict. And dissent in Parliament, the government suffers its biggest backbench rebellion. Good evening. NATO officials have admitted that another bomb missed its target last night. The Serbian government claims that a Belgrade hospital was hit, killing at least 3 patients. The air raid on the Serb capital was the heaviest for days. NATO officials say defections within the Serb army prove the air campaign is paying off. Our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, is in Belgrade. His report has been monitored by the Serb authorities.
Scarcely an hour after Viktor Chernomyrdin left here, when he'd finished his negotiations, NATO planes were back overhead. It proved to be a heavy night, and one of the bombs went astray. It was presumably intended for a nearby army barrack. Instead, it landed in the grounds of the Dragiša Mišović hospital. The patients were huddled into temporary shelter, but 3 of them had been killed, together with a hospital security man. 2 women had been in labor at the time. When we arrived a few hours afterwards, you could see the bomb crater and the intensive care ward of the neurological unit, which had taken most of the real force of the blast. We aren't allowed to show pictures of them, but soldiers from the barracks, which was presumably the target, were working hard to clear the rubble. They'd just discovered the last body. 2 nurses and a doctor were here at the time and were badly hurt. One of their colleagues, a professor of neurosurgery, told me that 2 of the patients had been killed were elderly people, one in their late 80s. Everything seemed to fit the notion that a NATO bomb had gone wrong, even a scattering of bullets on the ground, which at first seemed to indicate the presence of soldiers, but probably belonged to the security man who was killed here. Soon, the whole thing was turned into a political event. A group of Greek anti-war activists were bussed in and started demonstrating for the benefit of the assembled journalists in order to increase NATO's discomfiture.
Statistically, NATO's made very few mistakes in this campaign, about a dozen that we know of. But those mistakes have been so serious that they've had an important effect on the entire course of events. As the end game starts, this is the very last thing that NATO needs.
Churchgoers in Belgrade today were celebrating St. Saviour's Day, their city's patron saint. Disasters like the accidental bombing of the hospital are making life in this city very hard at present. But there is a growing feeling here that a political solution is getting closer.
And John Simpson joins me now from Belgrade. John, I'm sure you're aware of these continuing reports of defections from the army. I see one report here talking about 7,000 reservists pulling out. I'm sure it's difficult, but can you add anything to this, confirm this?
Well, I can't confirm it, no. I mean, there's no way of being certain about this. There's a complete news blackout over the area. And people in the towns and villages that we know that there's been some trouble in are really too frightened often to talk about it, certainly over the phone. But the highest figure so far that I myself have heard is 2,000 soldiers. It's perfectly possible, as I say, but we don't know.
In your judgment, John, would poor morale within the army reflect a wider malaise in the country, a loss of confidence in the Milosevic government?
Well, there are no signs of that in great quantities, I must say. I mean, you've got to remember that these men are reservists. That's to say, they're not professional soldiers in any sense, and they've been enduring very heavy NATO bombing for 2 months now. They've been there apparently for most of the campaign. So therefore, it's bound to be hitting them far, far higher than it is people in, say, Belgrade, where although the bombing is difficult, it doesn't necessarily affect you personally.
NATO is talking. There's a lot of talking going on at the moment, but of course the last time in Rambouillet when we talked, Milosevic used that talking as an opportunity for getting the killing going, starting the purges that took place. And maybe I could make the point at the moment that the Catholic Archbishop of Belgrade made in an interview with an Italian newspaper only 2 days ago, when he said that if NATO suspended bombing, Milosevic would declare victory. And he said that unilateral calls for peace are in reality prolonging the war. If NATO stops bombing now, the Yugoslav army will remain in Kosovo, and the guerrilla war with the UCK could go on for decades. So that's another brave man speaking out in the interests of peace.
So you believe that by continuing the bombing, what will happen? That Milosevic will actually be overthrown, and that is the only way to end this? Or what? The people will turn on him? There'll be a great revolution?
Well, there are a lot of things can happen, and overnight we've had independent reports of these desertions from the Yugoslav army. I think that's one of the things that is going to increasingly happen. Voices will speak out of Serb nationalists who see the damage being done by Milosevic to Serbia's future, and I think that that is going to add pressure to it. Now, if Milosevic wants to drag his whole country towards national suicide, then that would require the acquiescence of a lot of decent, honest, good people inside Serbia, and I can't believe that they would want to see their country going in that direction.
But if Milosevic is the kind of dictator figure that you paint him as, then he's in control of the country, and that's not going to happen, is it?
Well, he is a dictator. He's not a democrat. He is a thug and a bully, and he's been involved in genocidal killing. But there are people inside Serbia who are not like that. There are people inside the military command who don't have that suicidal mission for their own country. And as we are now beginning to see on these programs and others, there are people of substance willing to step out of the shadows and to speak the truth. And there are troops who are no longer willing to fight for what is an ethnically genocidal war going on inside Kosovo, and one which has got no chance of victory.
The fact is, though, that there are people in NATO who are now beginning to speak out, very, very important people indeed, like Chancellor Schroeder, who are beginning to speak out and causing you serious problems. I mean, NATO is beginning to come apart, isn't it? That is the reality. Let me quote you. You won't need me to quote you. You'll know the words well, but nonetheless, for those who don't, Mr. Schroeder, I will not participate in this specifically British debate on war theory, specifically British.
Well, I know perhaps he's noticing that there is this obsession in the British media with something that most people in NATO agree on, and that is that we will need ground troops to get the refugees back.
Sorry, in the media? That's just specifically in the media in Britain?
Well, I think that we have a tendency in this country to pick over some of these details in the way that other people don't.
Details?
In a 19-nation... Well, of course there are details. We are agreed in NATO that there will be ground troops involved in the end game and getting the refugees back in there. We are agreed in NATO that all of the options will be re-examined given the changed circumstances, and especially the damage that has been done to the Yugoslav war machine. We are agreed that we will look at every conceivable way of intensifying the bombing and putting increased pressure on Belgrade. But in a 19-nation an alliance with 19 democratic countries, you will always get differences of emphasis. But what matters...
This isn't a difference of emphasis, Mr. Robertson, and this isn't just another little NATO country. This is Germany, a very powerful country indeed, and this is Germany's Chancellor saying there is no question at all of ground troops. And you talk about the end game without actually defining what that end game is. That's the problem.